The wind outside Harper's cafe was biting. The kind that seeped through even the thickest layers and settled deep into your bones. Maddie Johnson pulled her worn coat tighter around her small frame, trying to shield herself from the chill. At 72, her steps were slow but steady, guided by the familiar rhythm of life in a small city that often moved too quickly for someone her age. As she pushed the cafe door open, a wave of warmth greeted her, mingling with the rich aroma of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked pastries. She sighed with quiet relief, grateful for a temporary refuge before her next task, taking her 1 p.m. medication for Addison's disease. An autoimmune condition she managed carefully. Harper's was new, boasting sleek, modern decor and an air of exclusivity. Maddie hadn't been inside before, but its brightly lit interior had called to her that cold afternoon. A small splurge, a pastry and a cup of hot water was her modest way of indulging herself on difficult days. She approached the counter, her voice gentle but clear as she placed her order. The young barista, perhaps in her early 20s, looked up from her register with a fleeting smile. "Coming right up," she said, her tone polite yet distracted. Maddie chose a booth near the window, savoring the view of the busy street outside. She didn't often sit still in public spaces like this. Life for a widowed grandmother was full of duties, from running errands to caring for her grandson, Jordan. But this brief pause, this small moment of warmth, was something she deeply appreciated. The atmosphere shifted as she sat there. From the corner of her eye, Maddie noticed a man approach, a tall, sharp-featured figure with an air of authority that seemed to fill the room. Charles Harper, the cafe's owner, exuded confidence and control, but his eyes carried a sharpness that was unnerving. He stopped by her booth without preamble, his expression cold and unyielding. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said abruptly. Maddie blinked, confused. "I'm sorry. Is there a problem? This isn't the kind of place for loitering." Harper continued, his tone clipped. "You've been here long enough. People like you." His words trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Maddie's chest tightened. "People like me," she repeated softly, her voice carrying the weight of decades of quiet battles fought and endured. Harper leaned closer, lowering his voice but not his hostility. "I don't want to make a scene. Just finish up and leave." The moment was surreal, like stepping into a nightmare that made no sense. Maddie, who had lived her life with dignity and respect, found herself facing an unprovoked attack on her character and existence. She looked around the cafe, searching for understanding in the faces of the other patrons. But they turned away, their gazes sliding past her as though she wasn't there, or worse, as though she was. "I ordered and paid for my food," Maddie said, keeping her voice steady despite the anger and shame rising within her. "I have every right to be here." Her calm defiance only seemed to enrage Harper further. "Don't you get it? You're not welcome," he snapped. "And that's not just about your order." He gestured vaguely at her, his meaning clear. Her age, her appearance, her very presence offended him. Maddie's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her cup of hot water. She didn't respond immediately, gathering her strength to maintain composure. Over the years, she had encountered countless small indignities, moments when she was treated as less simply because of her skin color, her age, or her quiet demeanor. But this, the outright hostility, the blatant humiliation, felt like a blow to everything she had worked to preserve, her self-respect, her belief in the goodness of people. Harper, emboldened by her silence, reached for her cup, his movements abrupt and cruel. "Here's your hot water," he sneered, splashing some of the steaming liquid toward her. Maddie gasped as it hit her hand, the pain sharp and immediate. Her pastry fell from its paper wrapping onto the floor, crumbs scattering. Her carefully packed pill bottle slipped from her bag, its contents rattling as they spilled onto the table. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The cafe fell silent, the only sound the quiet clink of the pill bottle rolling to a stop. Maddie sat motionless, her hand stinging and red, her dignity unraveling in front of strangers who remained indifferent. No one moved to help her. No one spoke up. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for a napkin to dab at her hand. Her movements measured and steady. She would not give Harper the satisfaction of seeing her break. But inside, she felt shattered. The humiliation burned deeper than the physical pain, cutting into her sense of self-worth. She had always been proud of her resilience, of the life she had built despite hardship. Yet here she was, reduced to an object of ridicule by a man who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. "Is this what you think of people?" Maddie asked quietly, her voice barely audible but carrying an undeniable strength. She met Harper's gaze, her own steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. Harper scoffed, waving her off. "Just get out," he said, "and take your mess with you." Maddie stood slowly, her movements deliberate as she gathered her belongings. The pills were ruined, their protective coating compromised by the heat and moisture. Her pastry was unsalvageable, a crumpled heap on the floor, but Maddie refused to let Harper see how deeply he had wounded her. She turned toward the restroom, seeking a moment to collect herself, her back straight despite the ache in her chest. As the door closed behind her, the tears finally fell. In the solitude of the restroom, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the encounter. Her hands trembled as she assessed the damage, the sting of the burn a sharp reminder of Harper's cruelty. She was exhausted, physically, emotionally, but something deep within her refused to surrender. This was not the end of her story. Maddie stood in the cramped restroom of Harper's cafe, her reflection staring back at her from the smudged mirror. She barely recognized the face looking back, eyes brimming with unshed tears, cheeks flushed with humiliation, and lips trembling with the effort of holding herself together. The burn on her hand throbbed, a cruel reminder of what had just happened. She turned on the tap and ran cool water over the red patch, wincing at the sting. For a moment, she considered leaving, walking out the door and letting Harper and his hateful behavior fade into a memory she could pack away in the deep corners of her mind. But Maddie wasn't built for retreat. She had spent decades fighting for her place in the world, navigating challenges that had demanded every ounce of strength she had. Her father had taught her to hold her head high, even when life seemed intent on knocking her down. She wasn't about to let a man like Harper take that from her. Still, the moment was suffocating. She clutched the sink tightly, trying to steady her breathing. The loss of her medication nagged at her thoughts. Addison's disease wasn't something she could ignore, it required careful management. And the pills now lying ruined in her bag were essential. Without them, her body would struggle to cope with the stress of this very moment. As she dried her hands, Maddie took a deep breath and straightened her posture. She adjusted her scarf, smoothing it with hands that still trembled, and pushed open the door. She would not let Harper chase her away. The dining area was quieter than when she had first arrived, but the air still buzzed with tension. Maddie noticed her booth had been taken by a young couple who were chatting as if nothing had happened. The scene felt surreal, as though she had stepped out of reality into some cruel theater. Spotting an empty table near the back, Maddie made her way there, keeping her head high despite the heaviness in her chest. She placed her bag carefully on the chair beside her and sat down, only to feel a blast of cold air from the nearby air conditioning vent. Maddie shivered, pulling her coat closer. She scanned the room for a staff member, reluctant but determined to advocate for herself. "Excuse me," she called softly to the barista who had taken her order earlier. The young woman approached cautiously, her expression hesitant. "Could you turn down the air conditioning? It's a bit too cold here." The barista hesitated, glancing nervously toward the counter where Harper stood watching. Before Maddie could say another word, Harper strode over, his expression twisted into a mocking smile. "What's the problem now?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the nearby patrons to hear. Maddie met his gaze. Her voice calm but firm. It's cold here. I was just asking if someone could adjust the air conditioning. Harper let out a short, derisive laugh. You've got some nerve, don't you? First, you make a scene. And now you're complaining about the temperature. Maybe this place really isn't for you. Maddie's heart pounded in her chest. But she refused to flinch. I'm not making a scene, she said quietly. I'm just asking for a little consideration. Consideration? Harper barked, his voice dripping with disdain. I think you've had more than enough of my time. Maybe you should try showing some consideration for the people who actually belong here. The weight of his words settled heavily in the room. Maddie could feel the stares of the other patrons, their silence amplifying the sting of Harper's cruelty. She wanted to scream, to demand why no one else was speaking up. But she knew better. Silence was often the easiest choice for people who weren't the target. Harper leaned in closer, his tone lower but no less menacing. This is my cafe, and I decide who's welcome. Maddie's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. And I've done nothing to deserve this treatment, she said evenly. I came here to enjoy a simple cup of tea and a moment of peace. Is that too much to ask? Harper straightened, his face darkening. You want peace? Then leave. The cold from the air conditioning seemed to seep deeper into Maddie's bones. But she refused to let it freeze her resolve. She met Harper's glare, unflinching. She had faced worse than him in her lifetime. And while his words hurt, they would not break her. But as Harper turned away with a sneer, Maddie felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The room blurred slightly, and her breathing grew shallow. The stress and the ruined medication were beginning to take their toll. Maddie clenched her jaw, determined to stay upright and composed. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something larger: dignity, justice, and the right to simply exist without being made to feel small. Maddie knew she would have to hold on to those truths if she was to endure what came next. Maddie's heart was heavy as she sat at the cold table in the back of Harper's cafe. Her body aching, her spirit tested in ways she had not anticipated. She had always prided herself on her ability to weather storms, on her ability to keep going despite everything life had thrown at her. But this moment, this confrontation with someone so openly cruel, was a betrayal she hadn't been prepared for. The room felt more suffocating with each passing second. As Maddie sat there, her mind raced with thoughts of her ruined medication. The looming sense of physical weakness from not having the proper dosage for her Addison's disease. She knew she couldn't stay much longer. But the fight within her burned brighter than the desire to simply walk away. She hadn't been in the cafe long when the situation took a sudden, darker turn. Harper, seemingly emboldened by his previous remarks, approached Maddie once again, his expression twisted with a new form of malice. He stood before her with a look that was both mocking and triumphant, as though he had won some kind of petty victory. What's the matter now, old woman? He sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. Still not satisfied with your little seat? Maddie took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. But the sting of humiliation pressed against her chest. I'm fine, she said quietly, trying to control her emotions. Harper, however, wasn't finished. I think you've been here long enough, he continued, his voice growing louder. You're making everyone uncomfortable. Maddie's face flushed with anger. But she held her ground. I haven't done anything wrong. I came here like any other customer, with the intention of enjoying my day. The cafe patrons, who had been silently watching from their tables, seemed to sense the rising tension. Maddie felt their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others indifferent, but none of them brave enough to speak up. The isolation she felt in that moment was almost worse than the cruelty she was facing. Harper's eyes darkened as he leaned in, speaking with cold intent. You've overstayed your welcome. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Before Maddie could respond, Harper snapped his fingers, signaling to the two staff members who had been lingering near the counter. They hesitated, but only for a second before they approached Maddie. Their movements stiff and uncomfortable. One of the staff members, a young man with a nervous look on his face, tried to speak gently. We need to ask you to leave. It's just. Maddie cut him off, her voice shaking but resolute. I'm not leaving. Not without an explanation. At least. Harper's sneer deepened. You heard the man. Get up. The staff members, under Harper's command, moved closer to her. They didn't touch her, but their presence was forceful. And Maddie could feel the weight of their physical proximity. She slowly rose to her feet, her legs feeling weaker than they had before. The stress of the confrontation, the lack of her medication, was taking its toll. But she wasn't going to let Harper see her falter. What is this? Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice trembling with a mix of indignation and pain. Harper, now fully enjoying the spectacle of her discomfort, smiled cruelly. Because people like you don't belong here. And it's time for you to go. In that moment, Maddie felt a wave of disbelief flood over her. He had stripped away her dignity, her sense of safety. And now, he was trying to strip away her humanity in front of an audience. The humiliation cut deeper than she could have imagined. As Maddie stepped toward the door, her balance faltered. The pressure from the adrenaline, the lack of proper medication, and the emotional strain all seemed to catch up with her in an instant. Her body gave way beneath her, and she stumbled, collapsing to the floor. The force of her fall sent her purse sliding across the smooth floor, spilling its contents. Her pill bottle, the one that had been ruined earlier, was sent tumbling as well. Pills scattered in all directions, a cruel reminder of the fragility of her health. Maddie's breath caught in her throat as she struggled to gather herself. But the physical pain of the fall was overshadowed by the crushing blow to her dignity. She felt her face flush with embarrassment, the eyes of the room boring into her. The two staff members hesitated, unsure of how to handle the situation. One of them knelt to help her, but Harper was quicker, moving in to further humiliate her. See what happens when you don't know your place? Harper sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. You're nothing but a burden. Maddie, lying on the floor, could barely comprehend the full weight of the words. But there was one thing she knew for certain: she was not going to let him win. She lifted her head slowly, meeting the gazes of the patrons around her. Some looked away, uncomfortable. But there was a flicker of something in the eyes of a few others, something that suggested this would not be the end. The moment felt like a cruel, sickening injustice. But there was something else too. Something that whispered to Maddie in the silence, this would not be forgotten. As Maddie lay on the cold floor of Harper's cafe, surrounded by the spilled contents of her purse and the shattered remnants of her dignity, the world around her seemed to slow. The pain from her fall was sharp, but it paled in comparison to the emotional devastation she was experiencing. Her body trembled, not just from the physical trauma but from the raw humiliation of being treated this way, in front of strangers who stood by, passively watching as though she were nothing more than a spectacle. The sting of Harper's cruel words, his blatant dismissal of her humanity, lingered in the air. She could feel the weight of the judgment from the other patrons as they avoided her gaze, each one perhaps too afraid to speak up or challenge what was happening. The silence in the cafe was deafening, a collective acceptance of injustice. Until something remarkable happened. A voice broke through the stillness. Calm but firm. What is going on here? Maddie's heart skipped a beat as she lifted her head, the confusion on her face mirroring the disbelief she felt. The voice was unmistakable, but her mind was struggling to connect the dots. A familiar figure, walking toward her, his presence commanding attention. It was none other than Johnny Depp, the actor who had entered the cafe seemingly out of nowhere. Maddie blinked, her mind still reeling. She had seen him in movies, of course, but to see him here, in the midst of this chaos, was something beyond belief. He knelt beside her, his movements smooth and deliberate, Are you all right? Depp's voice was gentle, his concern palpable as he looked Maddie over with a depth of care that was entirely unexpected in this situation. Maddie's head was spinning, but she managed a shaky nod, trying to push herself into a sitting position. Her hands still trembling. Her mind was caught between the shock of what had just happened and the surrealism of having Johnny Depp, of all people, offering her assistance. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Depp turned his attention to the cafe owner, his gaze hardening as he stood and looked directly at Harper. There was no mistaking the power in his eyes. He wasn't just a celebrity here, he was a man unwilling to stand by while another person was being mistreated. "What do you think you're doing?" Depp's tone was low, but it carried an unmistakable weight. The change in the room was immediate. It was as if the very air shifted. The tension suddenly charged with something electric. Harper's face flushed with a mix of surprise and irritation. "Mind your business, buddy. This is between me and her." "No," Depp replied firmly, stepping closer to the man. "It's between you and the right thing. You don't treat people like that." Maddie watched in stunned silence as Depp, in his quiet but undeniable way, held the cafe owner's gaze. Harper seemed to falter, taken aback by the confrontation. It was a brief moment, but in it, Maddie could sense the beginning of something, not just for her, but for the broader implications of how people should be treated with basic decency and respect. Depp's eyes softened as he turned back to her, his hand extending to help her up. "Let me get you out of here," he said, his voice no longer sharp but kind, almost protective. Maddie hesitated for only a second before accepting his hand. As he helped her rise, she felt a warmth, not just from his physical touch but from the undeniable empathy he was offering. Here was a man who could easily have walked away, who could have ignored the situation and gone on with his life. But he hadn't. He had chosen to stand with her, to make sure she wasn't left to suffer alone. As they moved toward the door, Depp glanced at the crowd that had been watching in silence. His expression softened, and he shook his head, as if disappointed by their lack of action. "Remember," he said to the room at large, "when you witness injustice and don't say anything, you're complicit." With that, he led Maddie out of the cafe. The weight of what had just occurred still hung heavily on her. But something had changed. There was an undeniable shift in her mindset, a realization that, no matter how small the gesture, standing up for what is right was something that could make a difference. Outside, the chill of the afternoon air hit her skin, but she felt strangely warm. Johnny Depp, a man she had only seen on screens, was now standing beside her, offering a kind of comfort that she hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. "Let's get you some tea," Depp said, his voice soothing. "We're not done with this yet." And with that, Maddie felt a small flicker of hope rise within her, a sense that the world could be better, that good people still existed, and that justice, however delayed, was still possible. The cold breeze outside Harper's cafe seemed to bring a welcome clarity, as though it was wiping away some of the weight of the ordeal. Johnny Depp, by her side, was a surreal anchor in a world that felt like it had suddenly been turned upside down. She had been humiliated, forced out, treated with cruelty, yet here he was, offering her not just support, but the kind of compassion that she had never expected from a stranger. Depp guided her down the street, his arm gently around her shoulders, his protective presence offering Maddie a sense of safety that she hadn't felt in hours. As they walked, Depp asked about her well-being, his voice sincere, attentive. She could hardly believe that just moments ago, she had been on the floor of the cafe, fighting to hold on to her dignity. Now, she was walking with someone who had the power to change everything, who was already changing things. "Thank you, Johnny," Maddie said softly, looking up at him with gratitude. "I don't know what to say." "There's no need to say anything," Depp replied, his voice gentle but resolute. "Just know that this isn't over. We'll make sure your story gets heard." Maddie nodded, her mind still reeling. But there was something in Depp's words that gave her a sense of calm. It was as if he was lighting a spark in her. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, there could be a path toward something better. Depp led her to a quiet spot outside a nearby cafe, where they could sit and gather their thoughts. He handed her a warm cup of tea, the steam rising in gentle swirls. Maddie took a sip, the warmth spreading through her, soothing her frayed nerves. As she drank, Depp pulled out his phone and, with a steady hand, started a live stream. Maddie watched him with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. The phone's camera turned toward her, and Depp spoke into it with a calm but firm demeanor. "This is Johnny Depp. And I'm here with a remarkable woman named Maddie Parker. What happened inside Harper's Cafe today should never happen to anyone. I'm not here as a celebrity. I'm here as a human being who believes in kindness, in standing up for what's right." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight. Depp's voice was genuine, as though every syllable was backed by an unwavering belief in justice. The live stream began to gain traction almost immediately, and as the numbers climbed, Maddie realized that this was no small act. The world, or at least a part of it, was watching. "I'm here because I can't stay silent when something like this happens," Depp continued, turning the camera back to Maddie. "Maddie has been unfairly treated, disrespected, humiliated, and dismissed for no reason other than the color of her skin. That's not something we stand for." Maddie felt her chest tighten as she listened to Depp's words. But there was something profoundly healing in his advocacy. She had been made to feel invisible, unimportant, but now, here she was, her story being heard by thousands. The world was paying attention. The live stream continued, and Maddie found herself speaking up, her voice still shaky but gaining strength. "I've lived a long life. I've seen a lot of things. But I never thought something like this could happen. All I wanted was to sit down, enjoy a warm drink, and take my medication. What happened to me, it was cruel. I wasn't treated like a human being. But I'm not going to let this break me. I won't stay silent anymore." As she spoke, the livestream comments flooded in. Messages of support, words of outrage, even people sharing their own stories of mistreatment. The tide was turning. What had started as a cruel act of humiliation was becoming something bigger, a movement. A collective outcry for justice and respect. Depp stood by her side throughout, offering quiet support as Maddie spoke her truth. He wasn't just an actor here, he was a friend. An ally in her fight for dignity. When the livestream finally ended, the response was overwhelming. The media, social networks, and news outlets all picked up the story. Soon, reporters were showing up at the cafe, demanding answers. The momentum had built in a way that Maddie never expected. What had been a personal tragedy was now a public cause. And Johnny Depp, with all his influence, had made sure her voice would not be drowned out. As the crowd of reporters gathered, Depp made sure to guide Maddie to safety, ushering her into a waiting car. The vehicle was surrounded by fans and journalists, but Depp's security team was quick to clear the way, offering them a sense of calm in the chaos. Inside the car, the conversation turned more personal. Maddie revealed her medical condition to Depp, how Addison's disease had made her life more complicated, how her medication had been ruined in the cafe. Depp listened intently, his expression one of deep empathy. "I want to help," he said, his voice sincere. "We'll replace your medication, Maddie. I'll make sure you have what you need." Maddie felt overwhelmed by his kindness. Not just the financial help, but the recognition of her humanity. The understanding that her struggle wasn't just about one incident, it was about years of living with a condition that many didn't understand. "I appreciate it, Johnny. More than you know." And with that, a small, quiet hope began to grow in Maddie's heart, a hope that this fight, and the kindness that had come from unexpected places, would help her heal. Not just physically, but emotionally. As the car made its way through the city streets, Maddie couldn't help but reflect on the whirlwind of events that had unfolded. The world felt different now, as if it had shifted on its axis, revealing new layers of possibility. She had gone from being a woman humiliated and invisible to someone whose voice was heard, whose pain had been acknowledged not just by Johnny Depp, but by so many others who had come forward with messages of support. When they arrived at her apartment building, the weight of the day settled upon her like a heavy cloak. She had been through a roller coaster of emotions: humiliation, shock, fear, but now there was a deep sense of exhaustion, mixed with an overwhelming gratitude. Johnny had not just been a figure of fame, he had been a shield, a source of strength in a moment when Maddie had felt the most vulnerable. He had helped her regain her footing. Depp accompanied her up to her apartment, his presence still offering a sense of calm that helped ease the turbulence of her mind. As they entered, Maddie was greeted by the sound of footsteps running toward her. And then, her grandson Michael appeared. The young man's eyes widened in shock as he saw who was standing beside his grandmother. "Grandma, is that really him?" Michael asked, his voice filled with awe. Johnny Depp smiled warmly, offering a handshake to Michael, who seemed frozen in disbelief. "Yes, it is," he said, his voice carrying that familiar charm. "And I'm here to make sure your grandmother is okay." Maddie couldn't help but chuckle at her grandson's starstruck expression, though she felt a wave of affection for him. She had always tried to shield Michael from the harshness of the world. But now, she saw how much he needed to learn about compassion, justice, and standing up for what's right. Johnny's visit, though brief, gave her an opportunity to share what had happened with Michael in a way that was more personal than any news report could ever convey. He wasn't just hearing about an incident, he was witnessing firsthand the kind of integrity that could change the world. Johnny took the time to explain to Michael why it was important to speak out against injustice and why standing by someone who was being wronged was the right thing to do. It was a lesson Maddie had long hoped to impart. But now it was being taught by someone who embodied those very principles. After a heartfelt exchange, Johnny said his goodbyes, offering his contact information in case she needed anything. "I'm just a phone call away. Maddie, don't hesitate if you need support. And Michael, you take care of your grandmother. All right?" With that, he left, and the apartment felt quieter somehow, the absence of his energy leaving a void. But there was something else. A quiet peace had settled in the space. The weight of the ordeal wasn't gone, but the sense of isolation that had gripped Maddie earlier in the day had dissipated. She was not alone. As the day drew to a close, Maddie sat down with Michael, reflecting on the events with a clarity she hadn't yet found. She spoke to him with a steadiness that came from the heart, trying to impart the most important lesson of all. "You see, Michael," she began, her voice soft but firm, "life isn't about always doing what's easy or popular. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. Today, we saw what happens when people turn away from injustice, when they allow cruelty to go unchecked. But we also saw how one person can make a difference. How Johnny didn't just look away, but he stood up. And that's what I want you to understand. The world can be a better place if we choose to act with integrity." Michael nodded thoughtfully, his youthful face reflecting an understanding that seemed to go beyond his years. It was a quiet moment, but a powerful one. Later that night, as Maddie prepared for bed, she reflected on everything that had happened. There was still a long road ahead. She would likely need to follow up with her medication and ensure the situation at Harper's Cafe was addressed. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting. Not just for herself, but for the values she held dear. The news coverage of Harper's apology played softly in the background, a final validation of her experience. The cafe owner's public statement was a reluctant admission of guilt, a small victory in a larger battle. But what mattered more was the support she had received, the community that had rallied around her. It was a reminder that no one should ever feel invisible or dismissed. regardless of who they were or where they came from. Maddie's phone buzzed with messages. Some from old friends, others from strangers who had heard her story. Each message was a thread in a larger tapestry of solidarity, a sign that her pain had sparked a conversation that could change things. As she drifted to sleep, Maddie felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. A quiet, unshakable hope for the future. For her family. For the world. And in the quiet of her apartment, she knew that whatever came next, she was not alone.